My father tried to sell me to my uncle's family for their business merger, so I escaped to America and built my own empire. I grew up in Mumbai, where my father taught me that family honor and business legacy were the only things that mattered in this world. So even though our textile company was struggling with debts, my father spent all his energy maintaining appearances with expensive cars and lavish parties to impress potential business partners and investors. My older sisters were married off by the time they turned 20 to men our father chose based on business connections rather than compatibility or love. I watched them transform from ambitious young women into quiet wives who asked permission before speaking. My father told me constantly that I was lucky to be the son who would inherit everything. He enrolled me in the best schools and made sure I understood finance and negotiations. Before any business meeting with potential partners, he'd coach me on what to say and how to act. Sometimes the pressure was so intense I'd lock myself in the bathroom just to breathe, without someone watching and judging my every move. While my sisters were taught to be silent and obedient as their path to marriage, my life was filled with business dinners, networking events, and learning how to close deals that would benefit the family company. All my father wanted was for me to marry into a wealthy family, merge our struggling business with theirs, and save our reputation. By the time I finished university, men from competing textile families started making comments about strategic alliances and beneficial mergers. My father would show me which families to cultivate relationships with and how to seem confident and capable in a way that made them trust me with their daughter and their money. My business acumen was praised, but my actual dreams were completely ignored. But that didn't stop me from my small acts of rebellion. I started applying to MBA programs in America without telling anyone. At the family gatherings I was forced to attend, I managed to research scholarship opportunities on my phone instead of networking. I even started saving money from my allowance and small consulting jobs, hiding it in a separate account my father didn't know existed. It always made me sad knowing I'd never get to use this education for myself, knowing sons like me were expected to sacrifice their dreams for family legacy, until one day when I met David. He was wearing a casual button-down shirt and jeans, genuine smile, American accent. When he walked into our company's Mumbai office for a potential partnership meeting, my father was watching me closely, so I was forced to follow the routine and act like the perfect heir. I walked up to him professionally, extended my hand for a firm handshake, and asked about his company's expansion plans in Asia. And instead of giving me the typical business pitch like every other foreign investor, he didn't even glance at my rehearsed questions. "What do you actually think about the textile industry's future?" he asked, genuinely curious about my opinion. For some reason, my guard came down. I stopped reciting my father's talking points and actually spoke like a real person with my own thoughts and analysis. That's when the strangest thing I'd ever experienced happened right before my eyes. The more authentic and insightful I sounded, the more engaged he became in the conversation. For the first time, I felt that rush of intellectual connection people always describe. He was the first business contact who actually wanted to know what I thought instead of what my father thought. After the meeting concluded, he asked if I wanted to grab coffee and continue our discussion about emerging markets and sustainability practices. I don't even know why I agreed, since my father expected me to report back immediately, but I did. And instead of pitching me another business deal or asking about my father's connections, he asked me questions about my own goals and aspirations for the future. And when no one from the office was around, he handed me his business card. Turns out, he was a venture capital partner for a major American firm. He invited me to visit San Francisco and meet with his team about a fellowship program they ran for young entrepreneurs from developing markets. For weeks, I kept watching for an opportunity to leave and explore this possibility, but it never felt like the right time to betray my family's expectations. Plus, I didn't want to abandon my mother and sisters who depended on the stability I represented. But then one evening, my uncle was over enjoying dinner with my father and me. My father disappeared into his office and emerged with documents from our family lawyer about a formal business merger agreement. "Your cousin Priya is finishing her MBA next month," my father said. Smiling so broadly, his entire face seemed to glow with satisfaction. "The families have agreed to join our companies through your marriage." And that's when my uncle said something that made my blood run cold and changed everything forever. "Finally, my nephew, you'll fulfill your duty. Priya's already agreed." A feeling of absolute dread filled my stomach. I looked over at my father, expecting him to clarify that this was just a discussion and not a decision already made without my knowledge or consent. But instead, he just nodded in approval and raised his glass in celebration. That night, I took money I'd been secretly saving for almost 2 years, grabbed my passport and a bag of essential documents, and kept David's business card safely tucked in my wallet. I didn't tell anyone I was leaving, just left a note on my desk that said, "I won't be anyone's bargaining chip." It took me almost 20 hours to get to San Francisco with a layover in Dubai. But as soon as I walked through the doors of David's office building in the financial district, I knew it was worth every second of anxiety and uncertainty, because for the first time in my life, no one looked at my family name or my father's reputation, just the business plan I'd drafted on the flight. When I saw David, his face showed genuine surprise mixed with concern. He immediately took me to a private conference room and listened to my entire story without interruption. He gave me $2,000 in cash and told me I could stay in his guest room while we figured out the fellowship application and visa situation. I bought clothes from a discount store that actually fit fit my personal style instead of the expensive designer suits my father insisted I wear. It felt so strange wearing jeans and a simple t-shirt that I kept checking my reflection, but I felt liberated from the constant performance of being the perfect heir. David helped me apply for a student visa through a legitimate MBA program. I started networking with other entrepreneurs who had similar dreams as me to build something meaningful instead of just maintaining family legacy. And one day, while I was working on my business plan at a coffee shop, I got the call from David. He told me that someone from a major venture capital firm had seen my pitch deck and wanted to meet. My heart raced, and all logic went out the window thinking this could be my real shot at independence. On the way to the meeting, I rehearsed what I would say, whether I should mention my family background or let my ideas speak for themselves. But as soon as I arrived at the sleek downtown office, I wanted to disappear completely because standing right there in the conference room was my uncle with my cousin Priya beside him, both looking at me with expressions that mixed anger with something like vindication. My blood turned to ice as I stared at them. The room spun around me as my carefully constructed new life threatened to crumble. I glanced at David, whose face had transformed from excited to utterly confused in seconds. His eyes darted between us, trying to make sense of what was clearly not a standard business meeting. The office was modern with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the bay. The conference table was polished to a mirror shine. My uncle wore an expensive suit that probably cost more than my entire month's living expenses. Priya stood beside him in traditional formal wear that seemed completely out of place in this Silicon Valley setting. My throat closed up, making it difficult to breathe properly. The taste of the coffee I'd had earlier turned bitter and acidic in my mouth. I gripped my leather portfolio to steady myself, my knuckles turning white from the pressure and tension. The distance between the door and where they stood seemed both impossibly vast and terrifyingly small at the same time. My uncle stepped forward with a smile that didn't reach his cold eyes. He told David that I was his nephew, that our families had arranged a business merger through marriage before I ran away like an irresponsible child abandoning my duties. When he reached toward me to put his hand on my shoulder, I jerked back sharply and told him not to touch me. When I demanded to know how they found me, my uncle's smile faltered slightly as he explained that family has resources and connections everywhere, that my father had been sick with worry and shame. He'd believed my father when he said I was being selfish and immature, but now he understood this was about my refusal to honor commitments made in good faith. David stepped between us, finally sensing the tension and the threat in the room. He told my uncle firmly that there had been a serious misunderstanding, that my uncle had claimed to represent investors interested in my tech startup proposal. David's protective stance gave me a moment to collect myself, to push back the panic threatening to completely overwhelm my ability to think clearly. I could see the confusion and growing concern in David's eyes as he tried to understand the situation unfolding. The way his posture shifted slightly, ready to physically intervene if necessary. He was taller than my uncle, but leaner, and I worried about what would happen if this confrontation escalated beyond words into something more dangerous. My uncle laughed, a sound that sent chills racing down my spine, despite the warm California sunshine streaming through the windows. He said he was very interested in my work as Priya's husband, running the merged family business, maintaining the family honor and reputation that I was destroying with this foolish American adventure. Looking at me over David's shoulder with eyes that held barely concealed contempt, he informed me that my father had booked plane tickets for tomorrow morning, that my mother was waiting at home and crying every day about my selfish betrayal. His laugh echoed in the modern office, bouncing off the glass walls and surrounding me like a physical threat I couldn't escape. When he spoke of my work as Priya's husband, he gestured dismissively at my carefully prepared business documents as if they were children's drawings. The mention of returning tomorrow, of my mother's tears, was clearly calculated to trigger the guilt and family obligation that had been drilled into me since childhood, making me feel like a terrible son for choosing my own path. My legs nearly gave out beneath me. Tomorrow. They planned to drag me back tomorrow to a life I'd spent months escaping. I backed toward the door slowly, telling him with more confidence than I felt that I wasn't going anywhere, that I'd left that predetermined life behind permanently and wasn't returning to it. My uncle's face hardened into an expression of pure anger as he accused me of abandoning family responsibilities and dishonoring generations of tradition to play pretend entrepreneur with Americans who didn't understand our culture or values. He gestured dismissively at David, who looked completely bewildered but maintained his protective position between my uncle and me. The door handle pressed into my back as I retreated, cold metal through the fabric of my shirt. My vision narrowed, focusing only on my uncle and the exit, calculating whether I could make it out the door and down to the street before he could physically stop me from leaving. When my uncle called my work pretend, heat flashed through my entire body, temporarily replacing paralyzing fear with defensive anger. The business plan I had created, the market research I had conducted, the vision I had developed for sustainable textile technology, none of it was pretend or frivolous. It was more real and meaningful than anything I had ever done within my family's failing company. My uncle reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone with deliberate slowness, offering to let me speak to my father directly. I could hear my father's voice coming through the speaker before he even put it on, that familiar authoritative tone that had controlled my entire life up until a few months ago. The sound of his voice, manipulative as it was and laden with disappointment, still tugged at something deeply embedded inside me. For a brief, terrible moment, I actually wavered in my resolve. My father's voice was stern and wounded through the phone speaker, but I could hear the familiar cadence and patterns I'd grown up with. He was speaking in Hindi mixed with English, saying my name repeatedly with that particular emphasis he used when expressing profound disappointment, asking why I would bring this shame upon the family after all they had sacrificed and done for me throughout my entire life, why I would destroy a beneficial merger that would save dozens of jobs. The guilt was immediate and overwhelming, washing over me in a wave that threatened to drown my newfound independence and sense of self. Images flashed rapidly through my mind of my father working late nights at the factory office, my mother cooking my favorite meals despite our financial struggles, the pride in their eyes when I graduated top of my class. Despite everything wrong with how they controlled my life, they were still my parents, and hearing my father's genuine distress caused an almost physical pain in my chest that made it hard to maintain my resolve. Then I remembered the nights I couldn't sleep because of the pressure and expectations crushing me. The hot comb incident was actually my father burning important documents I'd hidden, research papers I'd written about innovative business models he dismissed as Western nonsense. The way my family had laughed when my uncle announced the merger wasn't consultation. It was celebration of a deal made without my knowledge or consent, treating me like property to be transferred. I straightened my spine and found my voice, telling my uncle to inform my father that I was sorry he felt disappointed and hurt, but I wasn't coming back to India to fulfill someone else's plan for my life. The memories came in rapid succession now, unstoppable and clarifying. The constant criticism of my ideas and suggestions, the way my independence and creativity were systematically crushed and dismissed, the plans made for my entire future without my consent or input into decisions that would define my existence. I remembered the nights I lay awake hating myself for not being brave enough to refuse, for not standing up earlier, the mornings I woke up dreading another day of pretending to want what they wanted for me. I remembered clearly the way my father had nodded approvingly when my uncle announced the marriage merger, as if I were a chess piece being moved across a board rather than a human being with my own dreams and agency. As these painful memories flooded back with crystal clarity, I felt my resolve strengthen significantly. My voice, when I finally spoke, was steady and clear, cutting through my father's guilt-inducing pleas and my uncle's expectant stare with newfound confidence. I stood taller, no longer pressed defensively against the door, but standing firmly in the middle of the conference room, claiming my space and my right to be there. My uncle's face darkened with barely controlled rage. He lunged forward suddenly, but David blocked him firmly, telling him clearly that I'd made my choice, and he needed to leave this office immediately. My uncle glared at David with undisguised contempt, then at me with something closer to hatred, warning that this wasn't over yet, that family doesn't give up easily on their investments and obligations. He stormed past me, deliberately bumping my shoulder hard enough to make me stumble backward. My uncle's movement was so sudden that I didn't have time to brace myself or step aside. His face transformed from manipulative charm to naked fury in an instant, his features contorting into something I barely recognized. When he lunged toward me, his hands were outstretched and reaching, fingers curled as if ready to physically grab me and drag me out of the office. David's reaction was immediate and protective. He stepped directly into my uncle's path, his body becoming a physical barrier between my family and me. Though David wasn't particularly large or imposing compared to my uncle's solid build, in that moment, he seemed to grow in stature and presence, filling the space between us. His voice, when he told my uncle to leave, held absolutely no room for negotiation or argument. It was a command, not a polite request. When my uncle bumped into me deliberately on his way out, the force of the contact sent me sideways hard, my hip colliding painfully with the edge of the conference table. The physical contact felt like a violation and threat, a reminder of how he viewed me as something he could push around and position according to his will and the family's needs. The door slammed behind him with such force that the glass walls of the conference room actually rattled audibly, the sound echoing in the now tense and silent office space. When the door finally slammed shut, my legs gave out completely. I sank into the nearest chair, trembling uncontrollably throughout my entire body. David crouched beside me, apologizing profusely and looking genuinely distressed. He explained that my uncle had contacted his firm, claiming to represent a major textile manufacturer interested in sustainable technology startups. I nodded while still shaking, telling him it wasn't his fault at all, that my uncle was persistent and manipulative when he wanted something. The chair I collapsed into was leather and cold, but I barely noticed the temperature. My entire body was trembling violently, not just my hands, but my legs, shoulders, even my jaw, making my teeth chatter as if I were freezing despite the warm office temperature. Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the air conditioning running. David's face was pale with concern and obvious guilt as he knelt before me, his hands hovering near mine, but not touching, respecting my space, even in this moment of crisis and vulnerability. His apologies tumbled out in a rush, explaining how my uncle had emailed with a professional-looking signature and company letterhead, how he had spoken eloquently about investing in innovative textile technologies, how convincing his interest and enthusiasm had seemed over their phone conversations. With each word, David's distress grew more evident and visible. He blamed himself for bringing this danger and threat directly to my door without proper vetting. I wanted desperately to reassure him and absolve him of guilt, but speaking required more energy than I could muster in that moment. My throat felt tight and constricted by fear, and the effort of holding back tears of frustration and anger. When I finally managed to form coherent words, they came out in barely a whisper. I assured David that my uncle would have found me eventually no matter what precautions we took, that his determination and the family's resources were forces I had always known I couldn't escape from forever. When David suggested calling the police to report the confrontation, I immediately shook my head. My uncle hadn't done anything technically illegal that American authorities would care about, and involving police would only complicate my visa situation and create problems. I needed to move apartments immediately and disappear again. He knew where David's office was now and would find out where I lived very soon through his network of connections. The thought of police involvement sent a fresh wave of panic through my already overwhelmed system. In my experience, authorities rarely helped people in my specific situation. They would ask questions I couldn't fully answer, demand documentation about family matters I didn't have, possibly even contact my family in India for verification of my claims. And my uncle had done nothing technically illegal by American standards. He hadn't physically harmed me or explicitly threatened violence. He had only come to discuss a family arrangement, an act that would seem reasonable rather than threatening to an outsider who didn't understand the full cultural context and expectations. Besides, involving police meant creating an official record and leaving a paper trail that my uncle could potentially follow or use against me. What I desperately needed was to disappear again completely, to become invisible to the eyes and networks that were actively searching for me across 2 continents. David helped me back to his apartment, insisting on checking inside thoroughly before letting me enter despite my protests. Though the space was clear of any threats, I couldn't shake the overwhelming feeling of violation and exposure. My uncle was in San Francisco. He'd found me. The walls that had once felt like protection now seemed paper-thin and useless. The walk back to David's apartment was tense and vigilant, both of us constantly looking over our shoulders nervously, jumping at shadows and innocent sounds, the sound of footsteps behind us on the sidewalk making us walk faster. The city that had become my refuge now felt hostile and dangerous, filled with hiding places where my uncle might be watching and waiting. David kept himself positioned between me and the street, his body language alert and protective throughout the entire walk. His apartment building was modern and secure with a keypad entry system and security cameras in the lobby, but even these precautions didn't make me feel completely safe anymore. As we approached the building entrance, I scanned the street carefully for any sign of my uncle or Priya, any figure leaning against a car watching the building, any vehicle with a driver sitting inside observing the comings and goings, any indication that I had been followed from the office to this location. Though I saw nothing obviously suspicious or threatening, the fear remained constant, a cold, heavy weight in my stomach. Once inside, the apartment that had become my temporary sanctuary felt somehow contaminated by the knowledge that my uncle was somewhere in the same city, actively searching for me. I looked at my few possessions scattered around David's guest room, the textbooks I'd bought for my MBA classes, the laptop where I'd been developing my business plan, the few personal items I'd managed to bring from Mumbai, and wondered how quickly I would need to abandon them and start over somewhere else entirely. The thought brought a fresh wave of grief and exhaustion. I was tired of leaving things behind and running. I threw clothes into my duffel bag while David made urgent phone calls, looking for a safer place for me to stay temporarily. Every sound from the hallway or neighboring apartments made me jump and freeze. Every distant siren made me wonder if somehow my family had convinced authorities I was in danger. David finally told me his colleague Rebecca had a spare room in Oakland where I could stay until we figured something more permanent out. I nodded gratefully, too mentally exhausted and emotionally numb to speak or properly thank him. That night would be my last in San Francisco for a while. The next morning, I woke at 4 a.m., unable to sleep anymore. By 5 a.m., Rebecca picked me up in her car and drove me across the bay to her small apartment. She was a patent lawyer who'd worked with David's firm before and asked no questions, just showed me the spare room and told me to make myself at home and stay as long as I needed. 3 weeks passed in that small room. I worked remotely on my business plan, took online classes, and barely left the apartment except for groceries at odd hours. Then one morning, I received an email from my mother. The subject line simply said, "Please read, important." Inside was a photo of my father in what appeared to be a hospital bed, looking pale and weak with medical equipment visible in the background. The message said he'd had a heart attack from the stress of my disappearance and that I needed to come home immediately before it was too late, and I lost him forever. My hands shook as I stared at the image. My father, the man who'd controlled every aspect of my life, looking vulnerable and mortal for the first time I could remember. The email continued with my mother's desperate pleas about family and duty, about how my sisters were managing the failing business but needed me, about how this was killing him slowly. I sat there for an hour just staring at that photo, feeling the guilt crash over me in waves. David drove over immediately when I called him. He looked at the photo carefully, then pulled up my father's LinkedIn profile. My father had posted a status update that same morning about closing a new distribution deal, looking healthy and energetic in the posted photo. David gently pointed out that the hospital photo could easily be old or staged. My father had been hospitalized briefly for a minor procedure 2 years ago, according to public records. This was manipulation, not a genuine emergency. I closed the laptop and admitted I couldn't go back, not even for this. Going back meant the end of everything I was building. The next day, my phone rang from an unknown number. Against my better judgment, I answered it. My uncle's voice came through, cold and calculating. He said they knew I was still in the Bay Area, that they had confirmation of my student visa application, that they were giving me one final chance to return voluntarily with dignity. When I refused, he told me they'd already contacted my MBA program with concerns about my mental health and instability. They'd filed reports claiming I'd stolen family money and fled to America to avoid prosecution. They were systematically destroying my reputation and opportunities to force me back. I felt rage replace fear for the first time. They were willing to ruin my entire future to maintain control. I told my uncle to tell my father that I'd rather have nothing in America than everything in India under their control. Then I hung up and immediately called an immigration lawyer Rebecca recommended. The lawyer's name was Patricia Morrison. She listened to my entire story, reviewed the emails and threats, and told me I had grounds for asylum based on forced marriage and family coercion. The process would be difficult and lengthy, but I had evidence and witnesses. She could help me build a case that would allow me to stay legally and permanently. That decision changed everything. Instead of hiding and running, I would fight back legally with the full protection of American law. Patricia filed the initial asylum paperwork within 2 days. She documented everything: the threats, the arranged marriage I'd refused, the systematic control, David's testimony about the office confrontation, Rebecca's statement about me arriving terrified. My uncle tried one more tactic. He showed up at Rebecca's building somehow, demanding to speak with me. Rebecca called the police immediately. When officers arrived and my uncle started explaining about family obligations and arranged marriages, the female officer cut him off and told him that's exactly why asylum laws exist. He was escorted from the property with a warning. The asylum process took 8 months. During that time, I worked with David's firm as a consultant on emerging market strategies, finally using my actual knowledge and skills. I enrolled officially in my MBA program with a full scholarship I earned based on merit. I started building the sustainable textile tech startup I'd dreamed about. My asylum was granted on the evidence of coercion and forced marriage. The judge's ruling specifically noted that family honor couldn't override individual human rights. I was free, legally and permanently. I could stay in America and build the life I'd chosen rather than the one chosen for me. 2 years later, my startup had secured Series A funding. We developed fabric technology that reduced water usage in textile manufacturing by 60%. My company employed 40 people. I'd built something real and meaningful completely on my own merit rather than family connections or an arranged merger. I heard through distant relatives that my father had eventually arranged a different business merger, that my family's company had stabilized, that life had moved on without me. My mother sent occasional emails that I mostly didn't open, though I kept them all in a folder I might read someday. The family heirloom my father had tried to give me before the wedding announcement, his grandfather's watch worth over $50,000, sat in a safety deposit box. I couldn't bring myself to sell it or wear it, but also couldn't throw away this piece of family history completely, even after everything that happened. One day, I wore it to a board meeting for my company, not because I'd forgiven my father or accepted what he'd tried to do, but because I'd earned the right to redefine what family legacy meant to me. That watch represented generations of textile industry work, and I was honoring that tradition in my own way, on my own terms. David became my co-founder and closest friend. Rebecca introduced me to her brother, who became our chief technology officer. We built something together based on trust and mutual respect, rather than obligation and control. I learned that chosen family could be stronger than blood family. Sometimes doing the right thing means walking away from people who should love you unconditionally, but only love you conditionally. I chose myself and my dreams when my family tried to use duty and honor as weapons, and I'd make that same choice again every single time without hesitation. Looking back, that moment when my father announced my arranged merger was the moment my old life truly ended. Even though I didn't fully realize it at the time, I just didn't know yet that endings could also be beginnings if you were brave enough to walk through the fear and into the unknown. Taking my uncle's threat literally and refusing to return exposed the truth about what they really valued: control and tradition over my actual happiness and potential. The guilt still surfaces sometimes, especially late at night, but I've learned that guilt is the price of freedom when your family mistakes ownership for love. And honestly, I'm grateful they pushed so hard because it forced me to push back harder and discover who I really was beneath all their expectations.